that came up continuously was that folks were really interested in just an overview of mental health in schools. So I will be providing that for you today. Just a brief agenda. I did leave number 4 as questions, given that my email is included, and I certainly hope that you follow up with any questions or concerns that you might have, and any ways I can be supportive to your practice. Okay, so what is mental health when we're talking about it? I really like this Surgeon General's definition. It's a little outdated in terms of 1999 was a long time ago, which is hard for me to think of. But the definition really is still great. So, mental health is a state of successful performance of mental function, resulting in productive activities, fulfilling relationships with people, and the ability to change and cope with adversity. I think for our work and students' lives, we're really trying to help them build that scalability to change and cope with adversity. That's really the crux of a lot of the social emotional learning and development that we provide from a school curriculum perspective. All right, so we're just going to get into a brief overview. So, when we think about mental health, we are actually talking about your brain and your emotional and social well-being. So it's all those things coming together. Physical health is a giant component of this, and really the way they impact us then ends up in how we think, how we feel, how we act. It helps determine how we handle stress, how we relate to other people. There are some biological factors. So, in this, when we're thinking about mental health problems, there is some epigenetics at play. So, the biological transmission of disorders does happen, and it's like any other piece of health. I compare it a lot to cancer in some instances. So, if you know in your family you have a history of that, in this example, cancer, there are certainly some things you can do that would put you at a better advantage to avoid a cancer outcome later. The same for mental health. If you know in your family that there's a history, you can do some proactive strategies to help mitigate the potential impact or effect of a mental health disorder. Okay, so when we start thinking about mental health disorders, we are talking about disturbances of emotion, thinking, and behavior. And as I said earlier, they typically arise from a really complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. They definitely range in intensity and severity. So just because someone has a diagnosis doesn't mean that we have all the information based on whatever those letters are that have been ascribed to them. It's really important if you take nothing away from this presentation except this. It matters how well we know our students and scholars. Because again, no matter what we're doing, our relationship with them gives us a much fuller picture of what is happening in their lives and in their context. Certainly, it's going to give us a better impression as to how their mental health is impacting their lives. Just that would be informative for you as a school based practitioner. And also, the relationship is going to be one of the best tools, if not the best, in my opinion, to supporting folks who are having mental health concerns. So, Kara's 2 cents, stepping off the soapbox. So again, thinking about this, these mental health disorders do tend to lead to functional impairment in interpersonal, social, and vocational pieces of our lives. It can lead to functional impairment in all three of those arenas, or just one in particular, again, depending upon what that diagnosis is. And typically, diagnoses in mental health disorders are really responsive to evidence-based treatments. And I'm thinking about the diagnoses and not the person, in that, nope. Okay, so here's what we know about mental health disorders. When we're thinking about them in a general sense, they are disturbances of emotions, thinking, and or behavior. They do arise, as I was saying earlier, from a complex interplay between genetic and environmental factors. And there's definitely a range in intensity and severity as far as how that disorder shows up in someone. Um, A mental health disorder does lead to functional impairment, typically in interpersonal, social, and vocational arenas in our lives. And typically, mental health disorders are very responsive to evidence based treatments that are provided by trained professionals. It's important here to think about what mental health disorders are not, just because there's so much stigma still around this. So, mental health disorders are not the result of a personal weakness or any sort of deficit in personality. They also do not wholly define any one person. A person is not depression, anxiety, etc. Um, they aren't like the manifestation of like a poor character, and they're also not typically caused by any sort of poor nutrition. There's really weak science connecting that. And those are some myths that we hear a lot when you're a mental health practitioner. Other reasons why it's important for us to think about it that I've outlined here on this slide. The one that I really want to highlight here is that schools increasingly are seen as needing to play a greater role in facilitating the social emotional development and learning of kids. And COVID-19 has really brought this into sharp perspective, just how much schools and educators provide for our students in the context not just of their day, but of the larger scope of their life. So it's really important as educators that we get this education and that we continue to learn about mental health. All right. So in here is just some statistics for you. I do want to highlight that according to the US Department of Health and Human Services, about 1 in 5 children and adolescents experience a mental health problem during their school years. So 1 in 5 experience a mental health problem. Now, a mental health problem is certainly not to be confused with a long lasting disorder. However, it certainly impacts their functioning when they're in our buildings, and some of the characteristics are similar. So we see things like stress, anxiety, bullying, family problems, depression. This is one of those instances where I wish we were all together because I think folks would be jumping in with what their experience has been. We see learning disabilities, alcohol and substance abuse, just to name a few, right? There are also folks that are struggling with serious mental health problems, such as self injurious behaviors, suicide, and unfortunately, those concerns are on the rise, particularly among youth. And again, given the context of COVID-19, I think there's a lot of things that we're starting to get data on, but it will be years before we know what the long lasting impacts are. However, we do know isolation's really bad for kids. We also know that the prevalence of domestic violence has increased since March. So I think we can make some educated hypotheses around what could potentially be happening as far as the students in our classes and hard things that they're experiencing. I think it's also important here to highlight that unfortunately, estimates of like up to 60% of students do not receive the treatment they need due to stigma and lack of access to services. And of those that actually do get help, nearly 2/3 of those students only get help in schools. So again, this data is to inform your practice. I also put in a link to a comprehensive study here from the CDC. But the big thing here to highlight is normalize mental health and mental health disorders and mental illness as much as possible in your schools. I know folks spend times like there's like a mental health awareness month or a week. That's a really great start. And I would encourage you to normalize that conversation among students and staff throughout the workday. Like that should just be part of your school culture. Any way that we can work to destigmatize this will only support us in having our students get the help that they need and having us get the resources that maybe we're lacking in the schools right now. Okay, so I thought it was great to have national statistics, and I really wanted to localize this just to give you a little bit more breadth of the scope of practice that we're dealing with when we're thinking about mental health. So this was actually pulled from the 2019 Minnesota Student Survey from Ramsey County. And if you don't work in Ramsey County or you're just curious, like me, I would recommend that you Google the Minnesota Student Survey. It will bring you to MDE's website, and you can actually see student surveys for multiple years. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, like when they started this, but there's at least 4 studies worth of data, and they happen every 3 years. So it's interesting just to compare back, but this is the most recent. And I just wanted to highlight here that when we are thinking about our students, and I work in Ramsey County, so my students, um, we see trends where female students are typically impacted more in their reporting around emotional well-being and distress, specifically around those feelings of nervousness, agitation, feeling depressed and hopeless. And those feelings tend to increase. So that would be that nearly everyday line. If you're looking at kind of that ninth grade, eighth grade time period, it's really hard on young women during adolescence when they're struggling with these feelings. And we have also stigmatized for persons that identify their gender as male to not be allowed to express these feelings. So we can also assume that male students and those that identify as male are experiencing similar things because of the physiological changes that are happening in their body, the peer pressure and social expectations. However, they likely don't feel as comfortable reporting. Just a few things to think about. All right. So, mental wellness. What is it? So, I just wanted to highlight here that, again, there is that deep interconnection between physical health and mental health. And just like a person can have good physical health at the same time, they can potentially have a physical illness. People can have good mental health and have a mental illness at the same time. And there are some really great research backed ways to support positive mental health, which are outlined here. And again, if we were all together, I would ask you, what are some of your ideas? Other things that I didn't list here, but that come up often are adult coloring books, meditation, journaling. I personally like the getting physically active. I love walking my dogs. Animals are great for maintaining positive mental health. So, really, it's about finding what works for you. And again, having those conversations in school spaces so that we can teach those students skills that connect with what works for them. Often we don't bring this up in our curriculum, but it's so important that we do because kids don't necessarily learn this anywhere else. All right. And we've already started touching on this a little, but just wanting to outline that mental illness is really understood again within that broader perspective of psychosocial and related health problems. We usually think of it in terms of strengths as well as deficits, and there's this encompassing well being of students and their families. Another great resource that I wanted to highlight here is the UCLA Mental Health in School Program and Policy data. They have an entire part of the university that focuses just on school program policy related to mental health. And they had mentioned in one of their more recent studies, it was from 2018, that diagnosable mental health disorders generally range from about 12 to 22% of all children under the age of 18. And that's for kids that really fall in that realm of need for mental, emotional, and behavioral concerns. Okay, so this is where I give you the practice disclaimer that I am not a neuroscientist, surprising. However, as part of my training as a mental health practitioner, we did get some training in neuroscience. So this is not outside of the realm of my practice. However, I'm going to keep it brief just so I stay within my scope. Uh, the brain is involved in everything that a person does, thinks, feels, experiences. It's all interconnected to our brain functioning. most things the brain does depends on the different parts of the brain working together in a network, right? So it's about that interconnection of the brain working in order to make the functions that we need to happen. So the brain is made up of cells, connections amongst those cells, and various neurological chemicals. And those neurochemicals provide means for the different parts of the brain to communicate with one another. So, what happens when the brain is not functioning effectively? So, if a specific part of the brain needs to be working in a specific manner and it's not working well, or if a specific part of the brain needs to be working in a specific manner but it's working the wrong way, the brain pathways that help the different parts of the brain communicate don't work as they should. So, what does that look like? If the brain's not working properly, one or more of its functions will be disrupted. And that disrupted function impairs that person directly, and that they experience sensations that look like symptoms. So, sadness, sleep problems, etc. The disturbed functions could also be, depending upon the person, overactivity or withdrawal. Symptoms are used to determine if a brain may not be working well. And then the person's usual life or degree of functioning is typically disrupted because of the symptoms that are associated with that brain disruption. When we start thinking about the human brain where mental health lives, typically mental health disorders are associated with disturbances in 6 primary domains of the brain. So, thinking, perception, emotion, signaling, physical, and behavior. Each of these brain functions is the result of millions of neurons communicating with one another through various circuits using various chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And when the brain's not functioning properly in one of these 6 domains, again, a person experiences problems that interfere with their life in a significant way. And these circuits are disrupted, and the person can also, as I said earlier, develop symptoms that are then related to a mental health disorder. It is really important, though, to consider that some of these symptoms are actually totally normal or to be expected as a response to the environment. So, thinking about characteristics of a mental health disorder, which are just actually negative emotions, which happen to all of us, are like experiencing grief when someone you love passes away, or having acute worry if you know a big test is coming up, um, sleep problems when you're an educator during COVID, emotional tension when faced with a natural disaster. So it's really sometimes nuanced to tease out what is typical brain functioning and when are we looking at impaired brain functioning. For a good rule of thumb is if those symptoms are lasting longer than 3 to 6 weeks, that's a good indication that there might be something else going on. And in that, I am going to start talking a little bit about some of the major mental health concerns that we see in schools. Again, normalizing this, occasional anxiety is an expected part of life. You might feel anxious when faced with a problem at work. You might feel anxious before taking a test. If you're me, you feel really anxious after the 4th time you've hit the alarm on snooze. But an anxiety disorder is much more intense and involved than temporary worry or fear. People often confuse anxiety, which is just a state of constant, severe, persistent hyperarousal that's driven by perceived but not real danger, with a stress response in our brain about arousal to the environment. So just being thoughtful about there's a differentiation there. When anxiety reaches a predominance that interferes with a person's functioning and enjoyment of life, that's when we start to think of it as an anxiety disorder. For people with anxiety disorders, the anxiety doesn't go away and it gets worse over time typically. Symptoms interfere with daily living activities, work performance, school, relationships. And under that umbrella of anxiety disorders, there's actually a lot of different diagnoses that I'm not going to get into today. If you're interested in that, you can certainly ask. But I think it's just important to know a little bit more about some of the umbrella disorders that we see in schools. Again, just to fill your toolbox. I also want to highlight here that anxiety can sometimes look like ADHD. When a person who is anxious is misdiagnosed as having ADHD, what happens is they're often prescribed a stimulant. I don't know about you, but when I'm really anxious and I have coffee, it does not help. Most people are actually made up that way. So when we give stimulants to people who are actually anxious, what happens is we make it so much worse. So it's really, 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 really important if you have a student who's having a hard time controlling their body to get some more information before we talk to the family. A lot of times, I think school systems have superficial information, so we make some assumptions based on what we know. And it's really easy to accidentally direct a family towards their general practitioner and support, maybe even unbeknownst to you, a diagnosis of ADHD because you're just thinking about the behaviors that are showing up, but you might be missing a lot. So if you have a concern, I would just really strongly encourage you to slow down, get more information, consult with related services in your building before connecting with the family. Oh, again, I just wanted to highlight some information from the most recent Minnesota student survey. This particular portion was looking at fifth graders and how often they worry and how often they feel sad without knowing why. Um, and again, we do see that female students typically report higher, uh, and we can make some educated guesses about what's happening here. But it's pretty significant. I mean, 18, 27, I'm not mathing well, but we've got over 40% of kids who did this survey right here saying they worry a lot. And they really agree or strongly agree with that statement. Sometimes I feel sad without knowing why. Again, just looking at the female students here, we've got over 50% of children saying, yeah, that's me. And looking at the male students, we've got about 35% here. And thinking about the worrying, we've got about 32%. So that's a huge proportion of fifth graders in Ramsey County that are feeling this way. And again, please do look at your own county student survey. Oh, I did want to highlight here that when we're thinking about symptoms, often we can break it down into four categories: behaviors, thoughts, bodily responses, and emotions. The pieces I want to highlight here is that this is not hard and fast, right? So I have my little parentheses at the top that often looks this way. Uh, Everybody, regardless of their diagnoses, presents a little bit different. So again, it's really important to have those really great relationships with kids and get to know that person as a whole student before we delve into learning more about if they have a mental health concern. And just thinking about when we think about behaviors associated with anxiety, especially if you're working with like later elementary up into secondary school, um, oftentimes folks that are highly anxious avoid situations that they find fearful, and they typically tend to self medicate. And that can be super problematic. And we will talk a little bit more about substance use shortly. Okay, so some statistics here about depression. Um, Depression is common and very serious. Um, Severe symptoms affect the way people think, feel, handle their daily living activities. Again, it goes back to that interrupted sleep. Eating patterns are disrupted, work. I think right now in our popular culture, we tend to use lowercase d depression to commonly describe emotional distress or sadness. And really, right here, what I'm talking about is clinical depression, so the mental health disorder. And to be diagnosed with depression, symptoms have to be present for at least 2 weeks. And upside, social worker strength based, right? Um, it's very, very treatable. However, the treatment can be counterintuitive for folks who are experiencing depression. So, one of the best things we can do for folks who are feeling down is get them moving. We know exposure to being outside is wonderful for our mental health. However, if you're experiencing depression, you don't want to go out. Again, so that's that piece about it being counterintuitive treatment. Again, I do want to highlight this is super treatable. A lot of folks experience capital D depression at some point in their life. So, again, the more we can talk about it and normalize it, the better we can work towards destigmatizing it. Again, just breaking it down into some of those larger subcategories. So, mood, thinking, and physical on this one. Again, with the disclaimer, often, right? Because every person's different. Um, but these are just some things to be thoughtful about in relationship to depression. If you're seeing a person who's crying a lot, feeling sad or helpless, feeling discouraged, struggling to think, not feeling pleasure in their typical activities, those are things to be thoughtful about or to be concerned. They should raise your antenna. Okay, we see ADHD a ton in schools. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. People with ADHD typically have trouble focusing their attention on a single task and or sitting still for a long period of time. And I just want to highlight that adults and children can have ADHD. This is a really problematic piece for teachers, especially in general education, because it's super disruptive to students who are not experiencing ADHD to have one of their peers who can't focus on the lesson and or is fidgeting or running around the room. ADHD is caused by neural connections and synapses that are firing a little bit slower. And because of that slowdown or delay in our brain, what happens is our body is hyperactivated to account for that slow progression, which is why typically if a person has ADHD, they're prescribed a stimulant. That stimulant is meant to speed up the neural connection so then the body can settle. And if a person just has ADHD, we know in the mental health world that that course of treatment is highly effective. I started getting into this a little bit around anxiety, but I want to just think about when, again, as school systems, we are calling home about behavioral concerns that could be connected to ADHD, because ADHD is hugely overdiagnosed, especially in school age children, especially connected to school report. I want us to be thoughtful that what we could be seeing is trauma, and it could be ADHD and trauma. So, if a student or scholar in your building is experiencing trauma and ADHD, it's really important that we are also thinking about what are those school based interventions that we can do to support both the hyperarousal, struggle sustaining attention, as well as the fear. Because there definitely is interconnection in the symptoms. If you look at the overlap here, uh, and both of those things have to be adjusted for or accounted for in a classroom space and whole school in order for kids to be successful. Okay, so moving into substance use. Um, Again, I have to do the disclaimer here that I am not a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. However, as part of my training to be a clinical social worker, I have had some exposure to training around substance use disorder. So I am licensed to be able to talk about this, but it is not my primary scope of practice. I do want to highlight here again the 2019 student survey. And I pulled just the fifth grade for Ramsey County here because I was a little shocked, like how many kids in fifth grade were actually already starting to use a little. We know in the education world that these behaviors are typically underreported. So the fact that, where's the one? Right here, in the last 12 months, have used an alcoholic beverage to drink, such as beer, wine coolers, liquor, question mark. There's about like 10% of kids saying yes in fifth grade, which I was a little surprised by. Substance use, or substance misuse in this case, commonly occurs in young people. And I just want to be really thoughtful. What we see in schools is typically not like a diagnosed substance use disorder. However, the onset of the latter commonly occurs during teen years. So, those 10% of fifth graders we're seeing here is significant, especially if later on they could have a diagnosable concern. Currently, alcohol and tobacco are the most commonly used substances, while marijuana is ranking more of like a distant third on the list. Clinical interventions to help young people who are misusing substances are often provided based on the realization that some types of substance misuse or may raise the probability of substance related harm. A lot of young people at different stages and places in their life misuse a substance at some point, and that does not mean that they go on to have a substance use disorder. So, just to be thoughtful. Again, just some more data for you to review. And this is looking at a little bit older students, so 8th, ninth, and 11th graders. All right. So, in general, there are some things that we should just, as educators, be on the lookout for. And this does not mean that a person has a diagnosed mental health concern, but this means we should be really curious if we're seeing these things. I would invite you to pause here and really read through the list. In the previous slide, I did just highlight a few things that were important things for us to look for if we're seeing changes in student behavior. And here I really want to explicitly name warning signs that are connected with youth that are potentially contemplating death by suicide. We know that this is on the rise. This data is from 2016, and I think it's still applicable. I also want to highlight that there's no stereotypical suicidal type of young person. Really, anyone at any point can contemplate death by suicide. When we are thinking about warning signs, these are major red flags. The things that I mentioned a couple of slides ago about just things to be aware of, those are situations that you can pause, maybe take some time to see how the behavior goes for a week or two, consult with other folks. However, if you are experiencing big behaviors on this slide, specifically talking about wanting to die or kill themselves, or talking about feeling hopelessness and having no purpose, or saying things like my family is better off without me, those are major red flags that need to be intervened on right away. We do offer a more comprehensive suicide training that is available through the paraprofessional PDs, and I would encourage you to spend some time getting that education. However, if you see this showing up in your school building, immediate intervention is needed, especially if a child indicates that they have some sort of plan. I would even strongly push folks to not let that child leave the building, and always defer to your school site's protocols and procedures regarding any concerns around death by suicide or suicidal ideation. Schools really have bulked up those policies and procedures, which is phenomenal. And they've done so because it is such a big concern. So I didn't want to talk about mental health without highlighting this because it is so important. Again, in the Minnesota Student Survey, it does provide us some really great information and data related to self-inflicted injury, suicidal thoughts, and suicidal behavior in students recently. So this might just give you a better understanding of how this is impacting students and scholars in your area. Okay, so we're just going to move into interventions and supports as we start to wrap up. I really want to highlight when we talk about interventions and supports for mental health, it's not all about, right? I think often we have some myths in our head. Oh, well, if we're going to help a kid who has a mental health concern, I have to be a therapist. Well, no, relationships are at the heart of all intervention. And if having a strong relationship with somebody is so imperative to the healing process. It's also not about students that have diagnosable problems. Um, as we mentioned in some of the earlier slides, people experience varying degrees of distress throughout their lifespan. So it can be really supportive just to have a caring, kind adult who's aware of some of these things, support them through that hard time. Um, oh, and it's always not, okay, and here I do want to just start to move into interventions and supports. So I just wanted to highlight a few things here. I think oftentimes educators feel like, oh, well, I'm not a therapist. I shouldn't, be helping or supporting. I can't. I don't have the skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is, if you have a relationship with that child, you can support a positive intervention based in relationship. For a lot of folks, just knowing that someone's there for them is very meaningful. It's also really important here to highlight that this is not just about supporting students that have diagnosed problems. As I mentioned in earlier slides, throughout the lifespan, folks uh, have various degrees of distress in relationship to their emotions and mental health. And those people need just as much support to be successful in school. So just being aware of that. When we're thinking about interventions and supports, they really fall into these four big categories. Again, I'm not going to read it to you, but I definitely want to highlight the last bullet point, especially in our current cultural context around COVID 19 and the racial violence that's happening in our country, but has really been happening for like over 400 years, right? It's just really being brought into sharp light because of the news media. It is imperative as an intervention and support for all kids that we are addressing systemic matters at school that affect mental health. And that includes inequity, exclusionary practices, alienation, and blatant racism. When we're thinking about intervention and support, it is also great to consider if your school does not use a tiered PBIS or MTSS model. And really, what that is thinking about is at tier one, what do we do for every single kid that is built in to our school culture that supports positive mental health and development? Tier two is thinking about those students that are struggling a little bit more. How can we give them a little bit extra? And then at tier three, we're thinking about those students who are struggling the most and how can we provide them as many resources as possible to support, in addition to the supports at tier two and at tier one. And I've mentioned this, I've mentioned this, I've mentioned this. One last time though, by far our best intervention, the most powerful and effective tool we have is our relationship with kids. I think oftentimes when we do presentations live and I'm talking about mental health and wellness, I have staff say, "Well, I just feel really powerless. Like I can't do anything about this kid's situation. I can't fix, if they have a diagnosis." And yeah, you're right. And even though we can't fix the situation or, magically resolve a diagnosis, just being with a person helps them. It lets them know that they are not deficit. And it's really important for us to remember that the relationship doesn't just rely on them, right? Like it's reciprocal. So we really need to check ourselves and our peers in our building. How do we talk about kids? Do we talk about them when they're not around in a disrespectful or demeaning way? Um, what's our presentation like in a classroom? Like, are we really loud? Uh, do we move too quickly? Do we talk too quickly? I'm sure some of you here are like, well, yeah, Cara, you talk too fast. And I can assure you, I don't talk this fast for my students. But relationship is figuring out how we can show up in that part of the relationship to best support kids. And it's going to vary student to student. So I think there is some predictability and consistency that is always imperative to our practice. And we also have to be flexible in situations so that kids feel at ease with us. And again, if you've seen my other presentations, I always wrap up with this. And if this is new information to you, awesome. Ross Green is a researcher, and he highlights that kids do well if they can, right? It's about skills deficit. Um, I also want to remind us that adults are caring and compassionate when we take care of ourselves. Thank you so much for your time today. Again, here's my contact information. I do hope you will reach out with any questions or concerns. Thank you and be well.